There is a particular kind of grief that arrives not at the end of things, but in the middle of them. You are inside something good, a moment, a relationship, a version of your life that fits. And underneath the experience, barely perceptible but always present, runs a quiet current of dread. Because you already know it won't last. You've been here before. You know how this ends. And so even while you're still inside it, you're already bracing for the loss of it. Already calculating the distance between now and the moment when this, too, is gone. This is not a failure of gratitude. It is not a character flaw or a psychological wound that could be corrected with enough therapy or enough discipline. It is the predictable result of living inside a culture that has spent centuries trying to solve the problem of impermanence, building institutions against it, developing philosophies around the refusal of it, organizing entire lives around the attempt to secure something permanent inside a universe that has never offered permanence to anything. Alan Watts saw this. He saw it with the precision of someone who had absorbed enough Eastern philosophy to look at the Western relationship with change and recognize it not as wisdom, but as the primary source of human suffering. And what he said about it, stated simply, almost offhandedly, in the way he had of delivering the most destabilizing ideas with complete calm, was this. The attempt to hold on is not the solution to the problem of impermanence. It is the problem. The suffering doesn't come from things ending. It comes from the refusal to let them. Alan Watts was not a Buddhist. He was not a Taoist. He resisted every label with the same cheerful consistency because he understood that the moment an idea becomes a category, people stop thinking about it and start defending it. What he was, more precisely, was a translator. Someone who had absorbed enough of the Eastern philosophical tradition to understand what it was actually saying, and enough of the Western tradition to understand what it was missing, and who had the rare ability to hold both in the same hand and show people the gap between them. The gap, as Watts identified it, was impermanence, not as a concept, as a lived reality that Eastern philosophy had spent centuries developing the tools to inhabit, and Western philosophy had spent the same centuries constructing elaborate defenses against. The Western project, broadly speaking, has been a project of permanence. The religious version sought eternal life, the soul that persists beyond the dissolution of the body, the self that outlasts the self. The secular version transferred the same ambition to different objects, the legacy, the institution, the mark left on history that confirms you were here, and that your being here meant something that time cannot erase. The personal version shows up in the relationships you try to secure, the identities you try to maintain, the versions of yourself and your life you try to protect from the erosion that everything eventually undergoes. All of it, Watts argued, is built on the same foundational error. The belief that permanence is not only desirable but possible. That if you grip tightly enough, plan carefully enough, love fiercely enough, you can hold something in place in a universe whose only absolute constant is that nothing stays in place. And the result of that belief, pursued across a lifetime, is not security. It is a particular form of exhaustion that most people live inside so continuously they have stopped recognizing it as exhaustion and started calling it life. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Impermanence is not a philosophy. It is a description. It is what the universe is doing at every scale, at every moment, without exception or interruption. The cells in your body are not the same cells that existed 7 years ago. The person you were a decade ago, the specific configuration of beliefs, fears, desires, relationships, and self-understanding that constituted you at that moment no longer exists in any meaningful sense. The world you woke up in this morning is not the world you will fall asleep in tonight. Everything is in motion, everything is changing. The appearance of stability is exactly that. An appearance, a brief slowing of change that the human perceptual system registers as stillness. Watts loved the river as an image for this, because it captures something that most static descriptions of impermanence miss. You cannot step into the same river twice, not because the river is gone, but because the river is never the same river. The water flowing past you now was somewhere else a moment ago, and will be somewhere else a moment from now. The river is not a thing. It is a process, a continuous event. And what you call the river is really your mind's way of giving a name to a pattern of motion that has no fixed substance beneath it. The same is true, Watts argued, of everything you believe to be solid, including you. The self you carry around with such careful maintenance, the one you defend and develop and worry about and construct narratives around, is not a fixed entity moving through time. It is a process, a continuous event, more like a flame than a stone, something that maintains its pattern through constant change rather than despite it, and that would cease to be itself the moment it stopped changing. This is not nihilism. Watts was emphatic about this. To say that nothing is permanent is not to say that nothing is real. The river is real. The flame is real. Your life is real. But the reality of these things is not located in their permanence. It is located in their happening, in the continuous, unrepeatable, specific quality of this moment of being, which is available to you in its full depth only when you stop trying to preserve it and allow yourself to be entirely inside it. Watts understood that the intellectual recognition of impermanence is almost entirely useless on its own. Most people can nod along with the idea that nothing lasts. They have experienced enough loss to know it's true. The problem is not knowing it. The problem is what the organism does with the knowledge, which is, almost universally, to keep clinging anyway. The clinging is not irrational. It has a logic, and the logic runs deep. The ego, the sense of being a separate self with a continuous identity moving through time, is organized around persistence. Its entire function is to maintain the story of you across the changes that would otherwise dissolve it. To construct a narrative thread that connects the child you were to the adult you are to the future self you intend to become. The ego is, in its essence, a permanence-creating machine, and impermanence is its fundamental threat. When something you love begins to change, when a relationship shifts, when a period of life ends, when a version of yourself that felt stable starts to dissolve, the ego experiences this not merely as loss, but as a kind of death, because in a real sense it is. The configuration of self that was organized around that thing, that relationship, that period, that identity, genuinely ceases to exist. And the ego, whose entire investment is in continuity, responds to this the way any organism responds to existential threat. With resistance, with grief, with the tremendous expenditure of energy that goes into trying to hold in place what is already moving. Watts was precise about what this costs. Not just the obvious suffering of loss, which is real and unavoidable, but the more subtle and more damaging cost of the preemptive grief, the suffering that arrives not when things end, but in the middle of them, as you brace for the ending. The relationship you cannot fully inhabit because part of you is already preparing for its loss. The period of life you cannot fully live because you are simultaneously trying to preserve it. The moment you cannot fully be inside because you are spending half of your presence trying to take a photograph of it with your memory, so that you'll have it later when it's gone. This is the specific tax, that clinging levies on experience. Not just the suffering of endings, but the diminishment of the living, the reduction of every present moment by the anxiety about its passing. Here is where Watts makes the turn that most Western thinking never makes, the move from impermanence as tragedy to impermanence as liberation. And it is a genuine move, not a rhetorical one, not a reframing designed to make an uncomfortable truth more palatable. A different way of seeing that, once seen, changes what impermanence actually feels like from the instant. If nothing lasts, then nothing bad lasts either. This is not a platitude. It is a structural feature of reality that the clinging mind consistently fails to apply with the same urgency it applies to the good things. The suffering you are inside right now, the difficulty, the pain, the version of your life that feels unbearable, is subject to exactly the same law as everything else. It is changing. It is already changing. The you that is inside the suffering is not the same you that entered it, and the suffering itself is not the same suffering it was a moment ago, even when it feels static. But Watts was pointing at something deeper than the consolation that hard times pass. He was pointing at what becomes available when you stop organizing your experience around the attempt to secure permanence. When the grip loosens, not through an act of will, but through the genuine understanding that there was never anything to grip, what emerges is not emptiness. It is presence, a quality of aliveness in the present moment that the clinging mind, with its attention perpetually distributed between the past it's trying to hold on to and the future it's trying to control, never has access to. Watts used music to explain this. The point of music is not to reach the end. If it were, the best conductors would play as fast as possible, and the most satisfying concert would be the shortest one. The point of music is the playing, the experience of each note as it sounds and dissolves and gives way to the next, the structure that emerges not from any single note persisting, but from the relationship between notes that arrive and pass. The meaning is entirely in the movement. A note held forever stops being music and becomes noise. The same is true of a life. The meaning is not located at the end of it, in the permanent legacy, or the secured identity, or the relationship that will last forever. It is located in the living, in the specific, unrepeatable quality of each moment as it passes. And the person who understands impermanence not as a problem to solve, but as the very structure that makes experience meaningful, is freed from the particular exhaustion of spending their life trying to turn music into a held note. The question Watts was always circling, beneath the philosophy and the wit and the extraordinary facility with ideas, was a practical one. Not what is true about reality, but how to actually live inside reality as it is. And his answer, drawn from the Taoist and Zen traditions he knew so well, was not a technique. It was a shift of orientation so fundamental that it changes the texture of ordinary experience. The Taoists called it Wu Wei, literally non-action, though the translation misses the real meaning. It is not passivity. It is the absence of the kind of forced, resistant action that comes from trying to make reality conform to your preferences, rather than moving with what reality is actually doing. The image Watts returned to repeatedly was water. Water does not resist the shapes it encounters. It moves around them, through them, eventually through the rock itself, not by forcing but by yielding. And in that yielding, it accomplishes what force never could. To live with impermanence in this way is not to become indifferent to loss. Watts was not preaching emotional detachment. He was pointing at something more subtle, the difference between experiencing loss as a disruption to a permanence that should have existed and experiencing it as the natural completion of something that was always moving. The grief is real either way. But in the first case, it carries the additional weight of wrongness, of a universe that has failed to keep its promises. In the second, it is simply what love and time together produce, the ache of a note that has sounded and passed, which was beautiful precisely because it could not last. The practical shift, in concrete terms, is a shift of attention. From the future, where the feared endings live, and from the past, where the mourned endings have already occurred, to the present, which is the only place where anything is actually happening, and the only place where life, in any meaningful sense, can be found. This is not a new idea. Every contemplative tradition in human history has arrived at some version of it. What Watts brought to it was a way of articulating it that made it available to Western minds trained to think their way out of problems rather than feel their way through them. The thought that loosens the grip so that the feeling underneath, the aliveness that was always there, has room to be felt. The invitation is deceptively simple. Stop rehearsing the future loss of what you have right now. Stop treating the present as a waiting room for something more permanent. Let what is here be here, fully, without the constant negotiation about how much longer it will last. Not because it will last, it won't, but because the only moment in which you can actually be alive is this one, and every moment you spend bracing against its ending is a moment of it you did not inhabit. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics called wabi-sabi, the beauty of things that are imperfect, incomplete, and impermanent. The cracked tea bowl repaired with gold rather than discarded. The garden that is most beautiful in autumn, not because it has reached its peak, but because it is visibly passing. The face that carries the marks of a life lived, rather than the preserved smoothness of something that has not yet been touched by time. Watts would have recognized in this aesthetic the same understanding he found in Taoism and Zen, the radical proposal that transience is not a flaw to be corrected, but the very quality that gives things their weight and meaning and beauty. The cherry blossom is the central image of Japanese culture, not in spite of the fact that it lasts only a week, but because of it. The brevity is not incidental to the beauty, it is the source of it. A cherry blossom that lasted forever would be furniture. It is the falling that makes the bloom worth watching. What Watts asked, with a persistence that his audiences often found both liberating and uncomfortable, is why we do not apply this understanding to our own lives. Why we treat the passing of what we love as a failure of the universe to keep its promises rather than as the precise mechanism through which it becomes possible to love anything at all. The person who could love only permanent things would love nothing. There are no permanent things. There is only what is here now, moving in the direction of its own ending, and the quality of attention you bring to it while it is still here. Watts said something once that is easy to hear, as comfort and difficult to hear, as the radical proposition it actually is. He said that the only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. Not to observe the dance from a safe distance where the ending can be seen in advance. Not to choreograph the dance so that it moves only in the directions you have approved. Not to hold on to the last position of the dance while the music has already moved on. To join it. To enter what is happening with the full weight of your attention and your willingness to be changed by it, and to let it end when it ends, and to have been entirely inside it while it lasted. This is what impermanence actually offers, beneath the loss and the grief and the discomfort of a truth the ego would rather not face. It offers the only thing it has ever been possible to have, not the permanent, secured, protected version of life that the clinging mind has been reaching for, but the actual one, the one that is happening right now, in this moment, with everything that makes it precious built into the very fact of its passing. Nothing lasts. Not the pain you are carrying, not the joy you are afraid to lose, not the version of yourself you are trying so hard to hold together, not the world as it currently is. Nothing is exempt from this. And if you can sit with that truth long enough, not to resolve it, not to make peace with it in the comfortable sense, but to actually feel the full weight of what it means, what you find on the other side of the feeling is not emptiness. It is the present moment, which has been here the entire time, waiting for you to stop grieving its passing long enough to actually arrive in it.